Welcome everyone to Something Wicked Film Festival 2022. We are starting with the experimental roundtable panel. So if everyone wants to introduce themselves and what film they're representing.
Hi, I'm Ed Greenberg. I'm the producer and director of the Renata Road.
Hi, I'm Emma Panaz Eisner, and I am the producer, director, and every technical position literally on Layers.
My name is Gene Verkam, and I made The Dweller in the Woods.
Awesome. So we're starting with experimental. So starting from the get-go, experimental is very, that is the one genre in film that so many people not sure when they watch it how to feel about it. And there's always a lot of things that go about that filmmaking for you guys and then people for watching. So if you were going to describe an experimental film to a normal person, how would you describe it? And we'll start with Ed.
Well, if you're going to watch it, it's slightly different, I think, from if you're planning on making it, what you need to consider. But if you're going to watch it, you're going in to have an experience. Preconceptions won't do you any favors on an experimental film. Yeah, read the blurb, read a synopsis if there is one. There won't always be, probably not for most experimental films, but just go in with your expectations open, sit down and just enjoy the ride. With most experimental films, it's really what you take away from the experience more necessarily than what the author intended.
Well said.
Gene?
Your question was about making it or watching it?
We'll start with watching it, and then we'll talk about making it.
I think Ed said it best. You got to go in with an open mind. If not, you might leave disappointed.
Emma?
I mean, I think there's a really great Jonas Mekas quote that basically sums this all up, but I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically this idea that film exists on a spectrum between the entertaining and the poetic, and that basically experimental films are the poetic side, and they're exploring the more poetic themes of filmmaking, and it's conceptual and visual and not literal. And I'd say, yeah, from the perspective of watching it, just to go in kind of not thinking that you're going to necessarily understand it on a articulable level, but it might be visceral and it might just kind of deliver ideas to you directly through the images, basically, as opposed to being as more literal and more entertaining. So, yeah.
Nice. And now we'll talk about the filmmaking part, as Ed mentioned earlier. So starting with Emma, how was it? Filming your piece? And again, the same idea of what you're intending to show to an audience, what you want them to experience.
I mean, I'd hope my audience doesn't experience the same sort of level of stress and tension that I experienced making this film physically, because I literally did everything. But basically, I mean, it's an adaptation of a poem. And that the poem is the only thing that I did not do on the film. And I basically made all of my sets in a really detailed way, and the animations are not all that detailed necessarily, but the sets themselves took up a lot of time. I made life-size ones, and I made a miniature dollhouse, and I basically ended up animating a bunch of stuff with these set pieces that I made. And basically that was the way that the film was constructed. So it was really intentional, and everything was perfectly timed to fit the reading of the poem and stuff. So I'd say, because I really intentionally constructed it to have a certain feeling to it, that I think people should just be able to kind of watch it, and it should just deliver that feeling by default, even if you can't articulate it or anything, especially because it goes by really, really fast, because it's a short film, so that's kind of what it was like to make it, and sort of how I hope people would think about it from that point.
Gene?
Well, this is the first film I've ever made, so I had no idea if it was going to work or not. Shot on Super 8, no way to tell if the shots we were getting looked good or were even working. In fact, by the end of the night, I'm pretty sure we were just shooting spent casings. The motors were still spinning, but the film was shot. even to the point where certain scenes that I was hoping or needed to get back to begin editing didn't show up. So I really had to remake the end of the whole thing with like B-reel, essentially. But in that sense, I think making experimental film is setting out and maybe not necessarily knowing what your end product's going to be unless you plan it as meticulously as Emma did, perhaps.
Ed?
Just repeat the question for me. I was so engrossed in what everyone was saying there.
How was it on the filmmaker side of making an experimental film?
It's going to be different for everybody, and we've got three very different examples of films represented here. I think for everybody going into making an experimental film is you need to understand what it is that you're trying to explore. And that's going to be different. And most films are going to explore something, whether they're experimental or not. But you need to know what it is that you're looking into, what you're investigating, whether it's a theme, a style, or just a technique. I think the more you know about that in advance, and the more you've already researched what exists and how it works, the better prepared you are to put your own spin on it and put your own exploration into it. And that's what we tried to do with ours as a feature rather than a short, was to try and find something that almost bridges experimentation and helps to move it slightly more into the mainstream, so it opens itself up to a wider audience. And that was incredibly difficult. It took us half a year to a year to actually make the film, but writing it itself was the best part of 2 years to do that. With three writers and myself, to get the nuance right, the depth of it correct, the level of research that was required. And it was really hard, but incredibly rewarding. We loved every second of that writing process, even though it took our lives away from everybody for that entire period. And the whole film, that's one of the great things with most projects, but certainly with experimental, is once it's done and you've got your output and you've got the answer to your question, you can see whether it works, what an audience's interpretation is. Quite often it doesn't matter what the audience understands of your film, whether it's what you wanted in the original scope of it, or whether they're creating something new in their minds. The pleasure comes from seeing how all of these different interpretations arise. And so having these projects completed, for Emma and Jean as well, I'm sure it's the same. Once people start watching and feeding back on your product, that's when it's really exciting, because you get to see where you've developed as a filmmaker and where you're going to move through and go on to next.
Very well said. And actually, that will go to the next question of what made you guys go into experimental? When you think of all the different genres of filmmaking, experimental is the hardest one, because again, you guys have a message you're trying to portray that, unlike the stereotypical like horror or sci-fi or fantasy and stuff, it's a lot of people, depending on who they're walking into, will have a different interpretation maybe for what you're intending, or just have a different view of it. So what made you three decide to do an experimental film? I know for both Ed and Jean, this is your first time, and Emma, I know you've been doing this genre for a while. So what attracted this genre to you guys? And we'll start with Jean on this one, actually.
Well, I guess I didn't have a choice, essentially. This was like a pandemic project for me. So I was sitting around at home for the better part of a year thinking, like, what am I going to do? And what can I make that I've never done before? I'm a musician by trade. And I was always wanted to do film. In fact, I wanted to make the Foley for a film. And I realized no one's going to be crazy enough to let me do the Foley for their film. So I might as well just shoot the film silently with Super 8, which is a cool medium. And then I created all the sounds for it after. That was the thing I was really excited to do. But what's the saying? Like, you gotta use what you have at your disposal. So this is literally shot with like two people, me and the person behind the camera, in my backyard, essentially, which is a large woodland, area. So I don't know. I feel like I didn't have another choice but to try it with what I had at my disposal during the pandy.
Ed?
I think just going off the back of what Gene said there, the pandemic for a lot of filmmakers has, thrown a lot of obstacles in people's way, but also thrown out a lot of opportunities, because the creative juices get flowing and you have to think artistically around all of these problems that exist. So it's great to hear someone like Gene talk about making a film in that kind of situation and overcoming it. It's so easy for so many people, especially film students, during the pandemic, to just go, oh, I'm not doing it anymore. I don't want it because I can't do it the way that I wanted to. Well, that's not filmmaking. Because filmmaking is a series of obstacles and problems that we have to overcome. And the pandemic was just another one of them. And those people who have overcome it, which we're seeing a lot of, in festivals this year, especially, and the end of last year, really showcase what people can do when their hands are being tied. So that's really good. But for me, making an experimental film, this is a bit of an evolution from my history in short films. So this is my first feature film. So I'm a first-time feature filmmaker, director, but I have made short films in the past. And this really, for me, was just an evolution of process and areas of exploration that I've been looking into. This idea of interpretation and how audiences interpret what they see visually and hear orally has always been quite fascinating to watch. Certainly the early days of experimental filmmaking, where it scratches on bits of old cine reel and odd noises and sounds that happen, was a great starting point. And I made a film about 6-7 years ago now that explored that. It's called Farther Than the Trees, with a wonderful actress called Carly Smith, it's basically an interpretation of dreams. It's dream sequences put together in an artistic fashion, but with the same character that links it all the way through. So the film, in a sense, was a nonsense, but it was presented to audiences with the appearance that it had a narrative. And that was great, going back to everything that we were just saying, because when we polled the audience about what the film meant, there was so many interpretations that were absolutely brilliant and fantastic. So this film, The Renata Road, was an extension of that, but trying to move past it just being experimental and seeing what an audience could interpret, and taking it a few steps further into something that actually isn't a nonsense. It has got a story, it has got meaning, it has got concept to it, but it's presented in a style that audiences won't be necessarily accustomed to. And they have to have that open-mindedness when they go into it and go for the ride and see how they ultimately interpret it. But there is a solution to our film, for those who are keen enough and interested enough. You can figure out what it's all about, but unlike your standard structure where we get introduced to characters, the plot expands and we get a nice resolution that answers everything for us, none of those answers really come. We leave the audience with more questions, but it's all in there for people to be able to fathom, which is why the script writing process was insane and ridiculously long. But that's awesome, great, and that moves us into kind of the realms of Buñuel and Lynch, where we're starting to bridge realms of surrealism and the mainstream and have stories that are marketable as well.
Emma?
I think that basically, to some extent, experimental filmmaking is kind of the redheaded stepchild of regular filmmaking, i.e. it's kind of seen as somehow separate and different. And I think that that's primarily because non-experimental filmmaking functions in a way that kind of reminds me of basically the way a wood shop or some kind of like trade related, but definitely you have basically artistic organization functions. So basically I feel like there has to be a group of people who all work together to create a final product. And if not, then there's going to just be an undue, impossible amount of work that falls on one person, basically. Whereas experimental filmmaking just seems really the most similar to really just being an independent fine artist. And so to that end, it's kind of a way you could make films and you can make them to a top-notch degree, but you could make them as an individual person. And because the process, at least for me, of making this kind of film is something that's so connected to, the dream state and basically the unconscious mind, like coming into the conscious and all of these things, I really functionally think I make it better on my own than I do with other people being really involved in the production process. And I basically have been making films more lately, just also on the side that are ones that I've made with other people that are more complex, and they still have an experimental nature, but they kind of bridge over into non-experimental filmmaking because they're just, I guess, more expansive and broad. And I think that those kinds of films are interesting. Those things that I've made are kind of just experiments so far for me. But this kind of filmmaking, I just think, as a person who hasn't really gotten a chance to until now, because I'm in film school now, meet other people who are filmmakers, basically, it's been something that I knew I could achieve to the highest degree of success and actually make really good and refine and make perfect. And I don't really want to make something that I feel like I'm basically lacking and I'm actively behind other people resources wise to make, because I don't feel like I'm going to put forth work that's unique and special and interesting. And I feel like then that's not really work that's worth seeing. So that's basically why. And I also just honestly really love experimental film. I honestly think it's just really cool.
Oh yeah.
Can I add something to that?
Yep.
Something you pointed out, Emma, which is interesting, is like there's a balance between the degree of control of an individual and like the scale at which you can do that on. Like if you're making a film that you want to retain all the control, and The Dweller in the Woods, and it sounds like yours as well, was filmed like by you in a small controlled atmosphere, right? But the larger scale you go with that, the more you have to rely on others, and thus you have to give up some degrees of that trust and control that you need to produce the final result that you want. Just an interesting scale there.
Yeah, you have to definitely know that you can actually rely on those other people to be good enough to be competent at their work, which is definitely not an issue when you're dealing with other people who are actually filmmakers. But when the only people who want to help you are like your high school boyfriend and like some friends who can lift things and don't really know how to use a camera, then you're kind of screwed.
And you have to trust that you've embedded, incepted your vision into them as well, because if they're seeing something different than what you want to see, you start to there's a discrepancy there,
Oh yeah. And well said with that. And speaking of vision with that too, with experimental, I think I would agree with the biggest thing experimental too with vision is also the actual vision, the visual things that you see. With experimental, what the audience sees is one of the biggest things as you as filmmakers have to do. With Emma, she had to do stop motion and how meticulous that is. Gene, you mentioned earlier how you basically filmed everything with no dialogue and then put in the music later. Gene. And then Ed, your the Renter Road, it was, again, it's very much like, it's funny you mentioned about like David Lynch and stuff, because it was very much reminded me of like something like a Shutter Island or something where you don't know what's going on. And it's just this feeling of unease the entire time that you as a filmmaker has to portray. So starting with Emma, how was it when filming, deciding the images you do to portray? I know for you, Emma, specifically, you're covering a poem that your mother wrote.
Sorry, I didn't think I unmuted myself for a second there, but I did. Basically, first of all, I like how you said I had to do stop motion animation, like somebody made me do it, because I felt like somebody made me do it while I was doing the film. I was thinking to myself, who's inflicting this on me? This is really slightly painful. I'm sweating in the basement and I've been animating for 4 hours. But yeah, no, just kidding. But anyway, my mom is a poet, and she, in my opinion, is a really great poet. And I think that I'm basically blessed to have somebody who I'm close to who is a great writer, because that means I can talk to her about what the actual fundamental ethos and meaning of the stuff that she's writing is. And because of that, I have really quite enjoyed to adapt now 2 of her poems into films, because I think that for an adaptation, like adapting a book, it's basically important to find out what the core idea, on the part of the writer was in creating the work, and then try to find a way of making a third thing through the film, not just a second thing, but a combination between poem and movie to basically express that idea. So the images don't directly reflect what is described in the poem, but rather reflect, I mean, some of them kind of do, and they have motifs that are in the poem, like some of the plants that are described in the garden in the poem are in the images, and some of the sort of movements that are used to describe the way things are moving, I tried to reflect in the images and that kind of thing. But that's more so to tie it all together. But I just kind of wanted them to give another side and another perspective to the words that basically wasn't overtly stated. So this would just be a completely unique work that presented a different vision on the poem, but through kind of the voice of the original artist who wrote the poem, you know, because I wanted to express not my interpretation of it, but rather her intention in a way, because I thought that was more interesting. It also created a more kind of cohesive message in the work, because I understood the sort of underpinning of it and I wasn't just kind of winging it. So rather I was trying to express something through like more some conceptual images, I guess, but it was really a thought out concept. Yeah.
Well said, Ed.
That was a specific question for Emma there. What was the question?
For each of your genres, so for you, like you said earlier, for the images you were deciding for with Rental Row, sorry, where like again, like you don't know what's going on, and so when you were filming, like deciding how the unease, you have a lot of unease moments in the film as the audience tries to figure out along with the main character what's going on. What kind of made, as you're filming it, kind of made decide what imagery to use and stuff while filmmaking?
Well, the imagery is decided all in the screenwriting process mainly. I collaborate on most of the scripts that I do, so that we all understand what's going on. Because I think a bit like Emma was just saying, most of my work is steeped in psychology and explorations of the unconscious mind, teachings of Freud, things like that. So it's really important that the writers understand that as well as I do as the filmmaker. That isn't necessarily something that has to transfer over into the actors or the rest of the crew, but it's certainly from the writing perspective, it needs to be there. So the imagery was decided a long time in advance, and that's one of the reasons why it took so long to get the script to the state that we were happy with it, because we wanted to ensure that everything that happened in the film, visually and in terms of the dialogue, had meaning and purpose. Nothing was there just to move us from one scene to the next or to get one conversation to progress to the next. Everything had to have a second layer to it, so there was a deeper understanding to the film. So we end up with a surface narrative that any audience member can watch and can enjoy, like any cinema goer could or any movie goer could. But for those people who are interested in something with something more going on, a little more depth, a little more nuance, there's this second movie that's underneath, and that's really the answer to the film that's there. So that was incredibly difficult. So one of the things with the actors was that they all had to understand who they were and what they represented, but only in terms of their world, of their character, not necessarily the whole world of the protagonist, who is the person that we follow. He's in nearly every shot of the film. We follow this singular character throughout. So the actors can help to create the moments and create the scenes, as good actors will. But in terms of like the visual spectacles that happen, those kind of crucial moments in the film where we see something, those were core in the screenwriting process. The nuance of those performances, they come out in rehearsal and during the filming process, which is great. But it's interesting to hear the different perspectives, because G and Emma have done this predominantly solo, which is brilliant, and their work is absolutely fantastic. But because of the scope of what we were trying to achieve, we had no choice. It's actors and it's crew. And as you both mentioned, that level of trust is unbelievably important, especially when you're doing something that's a little more experimental or cerebral, because people have to be able to get on board with the direction that you're going. You can't pitch to them in a recruitment meeting, your standard narrative. Here's my action movie, here's my thriller, here's my drama, because it's not. It's something very different. And actors love that. Actors love getting their hands on something that's a lot more creative. But crew, they like stuff that's safe. They like to understand what's going on and what the end goal, where this film is going to be. It's like, so that's a tricky one, but you do it. And as these guys were saying, it does come down to trust, and it takes time to find the people who you trust and who you will work with and who you would work with again. But you can find them. And when you do, especially if you continue making experimental style films, you'll take those people with you on projects again and again, because they understand you, they understand how you think, they understand how you like to approach making films. And the pressure starts to alleviate after that. And it just starts to become a collaborative pleasure to get these products made and to get them out in front of an audience.
Well said. Gene?
Yeah, that was well said. I guess here's what I would say about the visual aspect. The idea started as like me scribbling on some unlined paper with colored pencils and pens, right? And that kind of turned into a storyboard, at which point there was like certain points where I needed to figure out how I was going to pull off the practical effects that resulted in the cool, mysterious things that happen in the short film. So I knew I didn't want to do any, post effects. I just wanted it to be like shot on Super 8. Everything that we had to pull off in person would just be captured on the film, so that all I would need to do is like kind of make cuts and line up the scenes in the order. We didn't shoot it in chronological order, but I just realigned it digitally. So the most ambitious visual that was, I thought, the most clever to pull off was we shot a projector at a cliff wall that I had previously painted on, kind of like the focal point. And then I created the special effect for this portal opening through the dimensions on the projector, shot it on the wall, then just shot it on film. So for me, it was very much like anything that I'm going to do visually has to be able to be done practically, so that we can just point a camera at it and film it. And that was, like I said, I'd never done anything like that before. So it was a fun challenge to figure out how to make that work. And then I learned a bunch of stuff, and hopefully the next time I do it, I can be more ambitious with the same type of simplicity in a way.
Well said. Well said. Awesome. One last thing I want to question I want to talk about is also with experimental film is, at the same time, back then, like, experimental film has been around for a long time, but I feel like in recent history, it's becoming more and more well accepted mainstream. Like, we have our Cronenbergs and David Lynch's and stuff, but we've got film studios like A24 that are constantly producing films that are very experimental in a lot of sense, but now they're actually being seen by a lot more people, like Everything Everywhere All at Once and stuff like that. So how do you filmmakers feel about experimental films now being more accepted by the wide audience, is not just seen as something that's kind of just niche that only small people see, but everyone wants to go see? I'll start with Ed on this one.
I think that can only be a good thing. The more audiences want to absorb pieces of work and have their minds excited by that sort of new creativity and things that are different, that only works in the favor of everybody, filmmakers, producers, and audience members, because there's a wealth of content out there that's becoming available. Films like ours at one point were only available really if you went to film festivals, and quite often very specific focused film festivals. But now we're at festivals all over the world, all of us, and the streaming possibilities start to become endless, which is fantastic. Netflix and Amazon, put on a wealth of products over there. Those are our two big ones over here. But audiences are looking for more. They want to see things that are new and things that challenge and excite them, which is great. And we can put all of that. I think there's a bit of a change in movement when we started to get all of the Nordic stuff, all of those thrillers that now go under that label of Nordic noir. We suddenly had these dramas, which we'd all seen crime dramas over the years, but suddenly there were these Nordic ones that appeared that really challenged the way that you thought and understood characters and story. And they really started to push the boundaries. And off the back of that, I think audiences really started to want more. So you got things like the OA that came out, which was very different, and audiences loved it and they lapped it up, and they look for more of that stuff now. The consumers are hungry for things that are different. Standard filmmaking is so widely accepted and accessible by everybody, that for those of us who are a little older, who we get into our 30s and we think we've seen everything. Well, now people are getting into their late teens and they think they've seen everything. And now they're already starting to get hungry for more, which is great because it's out there. Here we are with our movies. We're going to continue to make movies, and there's going to be more great stuff for people to watch constantly.
Well said. Emma?
I think that there's kind of always been a presence of an experimental style of filmmaking. Also, I agree with everything that Ed said, but I think there's also just been this kind of underlying presence of that in the mainstream. And that has been probably pre-internet, and pre-modern age, something that was less kind of obvious because people communicated less and obviously, and I think that to an extent people understood less that those films also were experimental. I mean, I'm thinking of films like Hitchcock's Psycho, which is a really strange film, or actually Vertigo is much more experimental than Psycho, honestly, but that film is just structured in a way where you're not really sure what's going on and what it exactly means until closer to the end. And there's kind of these disorienting, feverish sort of dream state like sequences of him looking for the woman and not being able to find her. And it almost feels like a Buñuel film or something, because it feels like it's a metaphor for something much greater than what's actually happening. And it's sort of irrational, and then I'm thinking also of some of the films that Jerry Lewis directed in the 1960s that are super colorful and brilliant, and they're masked with the idea that they're comedy, but they're actually really just very absurdist, and they don't really have a story, and they're really artistically perfect, and the sets are built in interesting ways. And those are also really popular in high-grossing films at that time. And again, something obviously people would have not thought of as experimental because it was so like slapstick focused, basically. And so basically, both of those people were really established filmmakers of their time. So I think that basically, to some extent, because they had made a name for themselves doing other stuff, people kind of saw it in that area of the other stuff and were kind of in a way tricked almost into liking it. And I think now there's an element of people don't really care whether or not a film is experimental. I think people care whether or not it's billed as something that they are not allowed to access because they're just lay people. And some art has been kind of historically really pretentious. And I know some filmmakers who are really pretentious who are like, I don't want regular people to be able to understand my experimental film. And it doesn't make any sense to me to have that attitude, because it's like, okay, so your film's bad and you just don't like it that people understand it, so you made it bad. But anyway, I think obviously the purpose of film is to communicate with people and to communicate with as wide of an audience of people as possible. And I think that people also are becoming more familiar with the structure of filmmaking because they're seeing it, so they're getting more comfortable with it. So I think it's going further than the other stuff that I just mentioned from an older, basically, era, and it's becoming more experimental. I also think, like was said about the Nordic films, those things are kind of based in a lot of European mythology, and there's kind of a lot of European mythos. I mean, my family is from the Czech Republic, and they grew up around a lot of really strange mythological stories, and strange stories, period, that are kind of what Americans would call like magical realism, basically. But in Czech culture, it's kind of just acknowledged as it's a story. Anything can basically happen, and you don't really call it that, And so I think to some extent that's true in sort of other European mythologies. And so I think that those filmmakers from those countries probably kind of see that as a more normal and typical way to tell a story than the cut and dry sort of way that American filmmakers often choose to tell stories, which is obviously reflective of the culture. But I think that kind of thing is just becoming more and more popularized, and basically regular people not feeling intimidated by it because the people making it aren't telling them they can't go see it, you know. I think that just makes people then in turn be more accustomed to seeing films in that format, and then it makes films of that format more marketable, and so more films of that format get made. So yeah.
Nice, well said.
There's few stories, in my opinion, my humble opinion, more entertaining than weird mythological stories.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what Emma just said very eloquently. I'm sure the three of us have all showed our experimental films to someone who was just like, I don't get it. Like, it just, there are people that want to see a nice, neatly packaged thing delivered to them, and at the end it makes sense. The more widespread these experimental elements in mainstream movie theater movies become, I think the more it chips away at people's willingness to want to see things that maybe don't always deliver in that neatly packaged way. And that's just exactly what Emma said, but same with Ed. But it's the truth. I think if you see a sequence in a film that you really like in the movie theater that's a little bit out there, you're that much closer to watching an entire film that's completely out there.
Oh yeah. Well said. Well, awesome. We'll go ahead and wrap this panel, first panel here today. Thank you guys for joining us.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So it's for Emma. I'm not anywhere near planning my next project yet. I'm still riding the ride for the Dweller in the Woods, but I'm toying with the idea of trying some small elements of stop motion animation. Do you have any tips or tricks or advice?
One, please, for the love of God, don't make it on film, because you will literally not be able to have proper video assist, and you will not be able to see what you're doing, and you will have the worst flicker that like any human being has ever seen.
Yeah.
Unless you're literally like Jan Schwankmeyer or like whoever made Wallace and Gromit. And that's basically the only exceptions that I can think of to that rule. But basically, other than that, I would suggest that basically you look into getting or building a rostrum style setup, which is basically a setup where you have like a flat surface with lights that are suspended above it. And I mean, like the famous, of course, example of this is the one that Walt Disney had in his animation studios that was, really just gigantic, and it had like 7 planes of like plexiglass that had basically stuff being animated on them to create depth of field and different layers. I don't have that. I mean, I just have a setup it's just one plane and the camera is directly above it, but it's a great way to be able to kind of move the camera up and down and have a frame that kind of pre-exists. And if you get basically really nice lights and you have the proper sort of setup to kind of prevent flicker, then that's really a great setup too, because then you can also, if you do end up with flicker, because it's all really flat and kind of contained, you can go in Photoshop and basically get rid of the flicker. And the other thing that I would say is really plan everything out in detail, and don't underestimate the fact that kind of the amount of frames that you make is literally almost nothing of time. Basically, even if you make it 12 frames per second or something, you have to make a just massive amount of frames. So you have to make sure that the way that you're moving, whatever you're moving, actually like corresponds to that in a way that makes sense. And also, if you have a room in your house that is just not really hot, that is the room to do your animation. I made my animation studio upstairs in my family's Victorian house, and it was the stupidest thing that I've ever done in my life, because now all the heat rises up there and I will just be in there and it's stuffy, and I had to put blackout curtains over the windows and stuff, and it's like being in the schwitz at the JCC. It's horrible. So yeah. Oh yeah, don't have like AC on because it will blow stuff around. That's basically it.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to do film. I don't know if I can do film again or not. I don't know. It was a lot. It was not cheap. And you're right. You can't see you don't know nothing about the final product until it shows up a month and a half later. You're like, oh, okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. I love stop motion animation too. Like everything you described, I'm like, yep. it's I appreciate it so much because it's so much work put into it, but also it's like, damn, it's so much work you put into it. But it
There's an
looks great.
element of it that's so inherently masochistic. Like you have to be willing to just subject yourself to like the worst torment and torture humanly possible in order to end up with something really beautiful. And there are parts of it that are really fun, but then there's always just going to be a stretch where it's really hot and you basically are considering killing yourself because it's so hot and you've been working for a really long time. But I just think the ultimate control that you have over it is something that makes it really great, especially for certain sequences. And I kind of can't stop basically putting it in my films and working it into my films because I think it's just a great way of literally fabricating images from the start. And they're real images, like you were saying before, Jean, that are created in camera. So I think that's really cool because I like digital animation and stuff too, but I don't like it as much because I haven't physically made the image in real life and then captured it, which I think is kind of the point of film partially.
Well said. Well, after that dip into stop motion animation, I wish we had animation panels so we could talk more about that stuff. But we'll go ahead and finish this.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, go ahead.
What do you guys know what you're going to do next? Do you have any plans yet?
Yeah, we're currently writing a second film that follows on from some similar themes, but is in a very, very much different style. It's film working title at the moment is called Ruin, about an up-and-coming actor who starts receiving some videos of himself when he was younger that implies that he did some films that maybe he shouldn't, but he's got no recollection of ever doing this. It seems like someone's trying to bring down his career, so it becomes a bit of an investigation mystery movie into who's trying to do this, but it's also very much a psychological thriller, and it's about how this character's mind just starts to crumble and his world starts to fall apart around him. So think 8mm with Nick Cage meets Lost in Translation. Lost Highway, sorry. Lost in Translation is a very different film. One of my very favorite films. But yeah, 8mm meets Lost Highway, and you'll be thinking along the right lines.
I can see you have the vision, Ed.
Yeah, we're very, very, very excited for this one. Yeah, really excited to get things going. It's going to be a bit of a head trip, I think.
Cool. What about you, Emma?
I've been basically currently working on for a little while now because I keep having to go back to USC and make films basically every week that I slave away on and completely lose sleep over that are basically different projects for like class. But I'm not going to submit those to film festivals because those are basically just, learning projects. But I basically have been working on over the breaks and stuff, this really ongoing project that I have that's basically based on this idea that I learned about actually through one of my friend's sisters, which was funny. But it's basically this pagan mythological idea of the mother, the maiden, and the crone as being the three cycles of life for basically women, and in the context of a matriarchal society with basically female god figures. This was kind of an important idea. And I thought that was a really interesting concept for describing basically the stages of life. And I thought it was, I thought it would be interesting to basically sort of track through the life of a kind of character, a female character that is kind of not really directly pictured or anything, but is kind of almost narrating visually the film, basically track through those three stages in her life and everything that happened in a way that uses basically a lot of dream-like symbolism and compilations of images that I have basically that I've already recorded that I've been waiting to use for something, and images that I am animating and live action images that I'm filming. And basically I also just really strange sound, hopefully, that I still have to work on thinking about how I'm going to do. But I'm sorry, I can't remember how I started the sentence that I was saying, so it just became a massive run-on, and I don't know, period. Anyway.
You're making an experimental triptych about the stages of, 3 stages of being a woman throughout your life. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I totally don't know like what it's like to have the other 2 stages, so I have been asking my mom. No, just kidding. But
you need primary sources. You need primary sources for that.
I've used a lot of really interesting props for the animation. Also, like I basically got my hands on one of my mom's old birth control pills that she stopped taking right before she had me. That's basically a circular thing that I've never seen something like this before, because I've not seen birth control ever that looks like this in one area, but it's a circular thing basically made out of plastic, and it's an actual container box type thing that you basically, I think you're supposed to turn it and pop out the pill for each day, so you remember that you took it. But it's totally full, and so I basically got to break it with a hammer and get it everywhere and animate blood coming out of it. So that was really fun. Yeah,
That's
I'm really
awesome.
excited for this film to be finished, so I can basically show it, because it's just like an idea that I've never explored before, and it's not directly related to where I am in my life right now, and I just want to try to kind of get a handle on it successfully. So yeah, but it's kind of hard.
It sounds awesome. I look forward to seeing it.
What about you, Gene? What's your next project?
I don't know. I want to do something sci-fi next, which I don't know what that's going to be yet, but I've been thinking, like, you guys ever see Lost? You know, Lost?
Yeah.
Dharma Initiative, like that weird sect, and they man the station and they have to like punch in the numbers and the thing resets. I don't know. I'm honing in on that right now, trying not to do exactly that, but something like that, where like I make a set that is like a control room and cycle a bunch of different people who are either actors or amateur actors through it, and let them just do whatever they think their character would do while manning this post, and then intercut that with like some scenes of things like hurtling through space. I don't know. That would be the stop motion part, but I haven't thought it out well enough yet, but that's what I'm thinking. I don't know.
It sounds
Well,
interesting.
there will be two definite attendees for the sci-fi stuff next year. Me, because my favorite film is a science fiction film, and I actually like science fiction, and Jane. So that will be good.
Yep.
There you go. Well, on that note, so yeah, well, if you guys, once you guys complete these, you know where to submit your shorts and films. So we'll go ahead and end it here. So thank you guys, all three of you, for attending. Please go see all three of these filmmakers' films, because they're all great. They're all great. And I hope all three of you have a good day.
Pleasure to meet you all.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It was great to meet you guys.
See ya.